In the last episode of the Spot Up Pod, I discussed the 21 players currently on the San Antonio Spurs' roster, with training camp approaching in October. Today, I want to go through some lineup ideas for the upcoming season. Who is most likely going to start? Which players would we assume are already in the core rotation? Who might be battling for rotation minutes? Let's go through those lineup questions in more detail. I'm Paul Garcia, and you're tuned into the Spot Up Pod, the official podcast of the Spot Up Shot newsletter. So for the main topic of this episode, we're going to have just a little bit of a lineup discussion in this episode. So I want to first begin with the starters. So before actually previewing who I think the starting five might be for the San Antonio Spurs by the time the season starts, I want to first look at who are the players that I think are locked into the starting lineup that for sure those players are going to start. So the first player is the easiest answer to this question. It's Victor Wembanyama. We know Wemby's going to start. That's just there's no discussion about that, no debate about that. I think another player who's a locked-in starter for sure is Devin Vassell. So Vassell and Wemby are locks, and then the third player, as I look at who's a lock to be in the starting lineup, I think it's Chris Paul, just based on what we saw when he agreed to sign with the Spurs. He basically, there was that reporting that he had that conversation with Coach Pop, and he wants to prove that he can still be a really good a really good point guard in this league. So I think just based off the conversations the Spurs had with Paul, he kind of understands that he's not coming in to be a backup, at least out the gate. He's at least coming in to probably be a starter for this young team. So again, I think those three players are locked in for starting spots. Chris Paul, Devin Vassell, and Victor Wembanyama. Before I go into some iterations of what I'm kind of looking at in different kind of starting lineups, I want to talk about just the rotation players. Who do I think are locked in players to for sure get rotation minutes, whether that's in the starting group or off the second unit. And here I've identified 9 players to be in the Spurs' at least rotation. Whether Pop wants to go with 10 players, 11 players, as his normal rotation during the regular season, that'll be a question up for that time later on in the season. But at least initially, like on paper, I think we can identify 9 players that are probably going to be in the Spurs' rotation. So regardless of lineup starting or not starting, here are those 9 players. So the 3 players I just mentioned: Wemby, Devin Vassell, Chris Paul are the first 3. Then Keldon Johnson, whether he's starting or he's coming off the bench, he's going to be in one of the rotations for the Spurs. Harrison Barnes, who the Spurs acquired via trade, whether he's starting or he's coming off the bench, he's going to be most likely in the 9-man rotation. Trey Jones, also, what he's probably going to end up coming off the bench now that Chris Paul's on this team, but still, Trey Jones will get minutes. He's been a foundational part of the Spurs team for the last few years. Jeremy Sohan will also get minutes, whether he's starting or coming off the bench. And then Zach Collins, I think he's still got that job right now as the backup to Wemby, as that backup 5, if the Spurs continue to go with Wemby at the 5 kind of lineup to start games. So I think Zach Collins still has a locked in position. And then lastly, Stephon Castle, the rookie. Pop basically said on a broadcast during one of the summer league games that Castle's going to get early minutes in his rookie season, and you expect that from Castle, a player who was drafted with the 4th pick. So with Castle, as I'm going to get into in a little bit, we don't know if he's going to start early on in his career, or maybe he might come off the bench. But I think for sure he's going to be in the lineup. Like, he's going to be one of those 9 players getting minutes for the San Antonio Spurs. So again, just out of the gates, before we dive into these actual lineups, I think the 3 locked in starters for sure are Chris Paul, Devin Vassell, and Victor Wembanyama. And then the 9 players who I think are gonna definitely get minutes are Paul, Vassell, Wemby, Keldon, Harrison Barnes, Trey Jones, Jeremy Sohan, Zach Collins, and Stephon Castle. So those 9 players. So now, based on that, let's kind of first have a discussion about the starting lineups, kind of just different iterations or lineup projections that I'm looking at. And then from there, we'll look at the second unit and then who's kind of battling for minutes. So regarding the starting 5, here's kind of the starting 5 I've been kind of just looking at for the last few weeks. And again, if you've been reading over on the Spot Up Shot newsletter, I've been writing these series called the Look Ahead. And what I like to do there is kind of just get a feel for what changes other teams made to their roster over the offseason. I've currently been writing about the Eastern Conference. I've actually knocked out 6 teams on the Eastern Conference. And what I'm doing in those projections is, one, I'm looking at when do the Spurs play these teams, and just getting a baseline of the changes these teams made. And then I kind of compare the two, just some early projections of lineups. I have the Spurs' starting 5, and then the other team's starting 5, and and then the bench units, and seeing who compares where. Anyway, with those pieces, if you've been reading those, you notice that I've stuck to one specific starting 5, and this is the one that right now, early, again, it's very early. Training camp hasn't even happened. But this is the group that I think is going to start just again right now, early on paper from what I see. I think it'll be Chris Paul at the 1, Devin Vassell at the 2, Harrison Barnes at the 3, Jeremy Sohan at the 4, and then Victor Wembanyama at the 5. So again, just early on, before any actual minutes are logged or anything like that, any preseason games, that's where I think the Spurs' starting 5 will be. I think that one makes a lot of sense. The only part that the only player you lose from that group is Stephon Castle, if you wanted him to start. So again, I think that for the Spurs, I would call this like the Sohan starting lineup, basically, because you're keeping some size out on the wing with Harrison Barnes, who can shoot, play some defense. Then of course you have Wemby at the 5. You have a Vassell who can shoot, can play make. You have Chris Paul as your traditional point guard there, and then you have Sohan who the outside shot is something he's still developing, but you have that presence there at the 4, where he's one of your defensive versatile players, where he can play out on the perimeter guarding defensively, or down in the post, or like in the paint area. So again, that's where I think this question comes down to the starting lineup. Are the Spurs going to start Castle, or are they going to start Sohan? And I think that's where they got to have some give and take. Only one of those players I think can start, and then the other player is going to come off the bench. So again, that's the starting lineup with Sohan at the 4, and then Castle will obviously be off the bench. And for the second unit in this lineup, I have Trey Jones at the 1, Stephon Castle at the 2. The third, the small forward spot basically is kind of up for debate. Right now I have Julian Champagnie in there, and I'll kind of discuss him a little bit more, and kind of that battle that I think is going to happen between him and Malaki Branham and Blake Wesley. So I have Champagnie at the 3, Keldon Johnson at the 4, and then Zach Collins at the 5. So again, on paper, this is kind of where I think they're going to be right now. The players, of course, we'll get more of those answers as training camp begins later next month. In October, in October, it's almost September at least, and then also the preseason games. So again, that's kind of the 10-man rotation that I think it'll be. Paul, Vassell, Harrison Barnes, Jeremy Sohan, Victor Wembanyama as the starting 5, and then off the bench you have Trey Jones, Stephon Castle, Julian Champagnie, Keldon Johnson, and Zach Collins. So again, that's the initial 10-man rotation that I'm kind of projecting early on, just right now on paper. So now let's go to another kind of lineup, another starting 5 that we could look at. And so this is the case where maybe Stephon Castle starts and Jeremy Sohan comes off the bench. So in this lineup, it's pretty much almost the same thing, except that Vassell's kind of shifting down to the 3, or you could even say Castle's the 3. But basically, we're inserting Castle into the lineup, and now Sohan's probably coming off the bench in this lineup. So here's what the lineup looks like. It's Chris Paul, Stephon Castle, Devin Vassell, Harrison Barnes is now like playing the 4, and then you have Wemby still at the 5. So in this lineup, again, you're losing more of Sohan's size defensively there. But you are getting Castle now, another ball handler, player who can create in the pick and roll. Obviously, very good perimeter defender, but also very much like Sohan, kind of still developing his outside shot. So that's the reason why I think that at the end of the day, Barnes will probably be a locked-in starter, because he comes in ready to shoot. That's something that the Spurs know he's going to be able to do, reliably. Is be a good defender, but then also being able to shoot, and that's I think the advantage why Barnes will end up getting starting minutes, whether that's Castle comes off the bench or Sohan who comes off the bench, because those two players, the outside shot is the one part that might have to leave one of those two players on the bench to at least begin games. So again, if the Spurs want to go with Castle in the starting lineup, I think that's the lineup they go to, is having Sohan now in this scenario come off the bench. But let's also not forget about one of the Spurs' other foundational players, and that's Keldon Johnson. So we know that, he did start last year to begin the year. Then later on in the season, they ended up having him move to the bench. Just to one, like they wanted to get Wemby and Vassell some more, creation abilities for themselves and others. And then, Keldon was like kind of that spark plug off the bench, kind of got to do a little bit more on his end as well. Coming off the bench, he got more possessions, got more responsibility there. So that was one of the reasons for moving him to the bench last year. So what if the Spurs want to have Keldon be part of the starting lineup this year? So if this is the case, then I think it's basically another scenario where probably if that happens again, I think this is the furthest idea is having Keldon start. But again, here I think that it ends up being where you have to put both Castle and Sohan on the bench in this case. So here's where I see this lineup going. It would be Chris Paul at the 1, Devin Vassell at the 2, Keldon Johnson at the 3, Harrison Barnes at the 4, and then Victor Wembanyama at the 5. So again, that's kind of those are kind of just 3 early starting lineups that I'm kind of just projecting, kind of just getting a look at early on. And again, we'll start to get some of these answers to these questions, especially maybe in training camp, as we see some footage come out from the players and their scrimmages, seeing which players are on the same sides together, and then even sometimes the players reveal to the media questions. They'll be asked, who have you been playing with, or who have you got the most minutes alongside in practices, and sometimes they'll share, I've been playing with this, I've been in this lineup with these guys, and etc. So, and if not, we can wait till the first preseason game and pop will obviously put out some of the first few lineups. So again, that's kind of where I think that things are with regarding the starting five, where it's going to be. With again, right now, early on in late August, I'm still sticking with Chris Paul, Devin Vassell, Harrison Barnes, Jeremy Sohan, and Wemby as my early prediction. Again, this could all change in about a month. So again, sticking to that example of the second unit with Jones, Castle, Champagnie, Keldon, and Collins, I kind of want to focus only on Champagnie, and here's the reason why. I think that's the spot that's kind of up for grabs. Like I mentioned earlier to start this episode, there's kind of like 9 players who are locked into that core rotation. So from there, it's like that 10th or 11th player. Who are those players? And I think this is where there can be a battle in training camp and in the preseason to see who kind of wins out there. And I think there's 3 options here. You could have Champagnie, who I have on paper right now in that slot because he's giving you known outside shooting. He's a reliable shooter from outside for the Spurs. He plays pretty good defense out on the perimeter, and so it's one of the reasons why he ended up getting the starting job last year. Pop could at least rely on him for both his shooting and his defense out there. So I think that's where he has the advantage right now. Coming into this season, and we saw that even though he doesn't make maybe financially as much as some of the other players on the team, you did see that the Spurs did everything they could this offseason to keep him on their roster without having to waive him or trade him. And then we even saw that just a few weeks ago they let his contract actually fully guarantee. So again, I think right now that 10th spot belongs to Champagnie. But the 2 players who have been part of the rotation, but now that there's more players added, more veteran players added to this team, I think that they're going to be fighting for that spot or battling for that spot are both Malaki Branham and Blake Wesley. So Branham, obviously, his shot can be up and down. His outside shot, we know he's more so like a 3-level scorer. A little bit more playmaking from him. So that's where he might have an edge over Julian Champagnie. And then, but defensively, I think Champagnie still has the advantage over Branham. So again, Branham could be battling with Champagnie for minutes, or there's also Blake Wesley. And so Wesley obviously wouldn't play the 3, which is that spot I'm talking about. But in this case, let's just say Wesley was trying to battle for that open spot. Then I think in that case, you shift whoever's that at the 2 right now on the bench. So someone like Castle shifts down to the 3, and then you have Wesley play more of that 2 and kind of run some combo guard minutes with Trey Jones. So again, with Wesley too, his shot's still developing. It's not quite there yet. His outside shot, offensively, he can get to the basket. He's really quick, but kind of still developing his shooting, his playmaking on offense, and then defensively, that's what he's known for as well. Like he's hounding kind of defense, kind of just disrupting passing lanes, being very aggressive on the ball, and so that's what kind of gives him a little bit of an edge in terms of trying to beat out maybe Champagnie for some of those minutes. But right now, again, on paper, I do have Champagnie getting that 10th man spot. And one thing Pop could do, honestly, and he's done this before, is maybe play even like 11 players in a regular season game where he has 2 of those players, like maybe like Branham and Champagnie split the minutes, or Branham and Wesley, Champagnie and Wesley split minutes. So something like that could also happen in that case. But again, as long as everyone's healthy on this roster, I do think that those are those 9 players I mentioned earlier are definitely going to be in games, whether some of them are starting as those players or they're coming off the bench. And so now, just for one of the last kind of continue to stay with some of the lineup conversations and questions, I wanted to just look at some players who are kind of like outside the rotation, in my opinion, early on, just on paper, where this team stands. And so let's first begin with Charles Bassey. So, like we saw last year, he was actually the Spurs' backup center to begin the year. When Zach Collins was actually starting, so the Spurs needed a backup big, and that was Bassey. But then once he got hurt, later on, Pop changed the lineup, and Wemby becomes the 5. So then Zach takes up that backup 5 spot. And then now, so basically what Bassey has to do coming into training camp and preseason, he has to basically beat out Zach Collins back for his old job, which is that backup 5. So that, again, that's kind of where his position battle will be trying to be more efficient than Zach Collins on both ends of the floor to try to get those backup 5 minutes. I think that's where Bassey's at in the rotation. And then regarding Sandro Mamukelashvili, who the Spurs recently re-signed, his spot as far as getting some of those backup 4 minutes, I think it depends on where Keldon Johnson plays. If Keldon starts, then maybe there's better opportunity for him. If Keldon plays at the 3 in the backup unit, then there's better opportunity for Mamu. But I don't think that Mamu's going to be able to beat out Keldon for the backup 4 spot. So that's probably not on the table. But at least if Keldon shifts to a different position, basically, I think there's a better chance for Mamu to try to get into the rotation, because outside of Keldon, there's not really a player there for that backup 4 role. So that could be Sandro Mamukelashvili. So that's mainly what I wanted to do in this episode. Was just kind of again, it's only when am I recording this on August 28th. So it's not even September yet. There's still a lot of time before the season starts. But early on, just kind of wanted to. This is something I wrote about a few weeks ago, and I kind of just wanted to get it more in audio and video format, just talking through the early lineup projections and where I think maybe some of the starters will be, and where the second unit players will wind up playing with the Spurs. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode of the Spotted Pod. If you like what you heard, please subscribe on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also watch portions of this episode by subscribing to our YouTube page at The Spot Up Pod. The music for this episode was written by Vincent Garcia and Paul Garcia. I'm Paul Garcia, and thank you for listening, and have a great day.